Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. This time we're going to be talking about autism research,
Oh, very cool.
but with like a specific focus. And our guide for this whole deep dive is an article that was published last year, 2025, by Jaime Hoerricks, PhD, titled "Where's the Support? Autism Research in 2025 Still Ignores Autistic Adulthood."
Okay.
And it was published in the outside.
Interesting.
And basically the whole point of this deep dive is to go beyond just like the typical headlines that you see about autism research and really kind of dig into some of the nuances
Right.
and like what's actually going on. Because this article is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that is so interesting about it to me is that Horrocks doesn't just present the research findings, but actually critiques the whole research landscape.
Yeah.
Like they're pointing out that there's this big gap between what's being studied and what autistic adults actually need.
Yeah, it's like we're searching for clues in a mystery.
Right.
And the clues are like spread out across all these different studies.
Exactly. And as we put those clues together, we're going to see this pattern that might make you question, like, whose needs are actually being met.
Okay, that's a little ominous.
A little bit, yeah.
But I'm intrigued. So where do we even begin with this?
So Herricks actually starts by highlighting some positive developments.
Okay.
And they point to a handful of studies from 2024 that actually did focus on the real-life needs of autistic adults, particularly when it comes to employment and housing.
Okay, let's hear it. Let's hear some good news.
So one study by Burry and his colleagues looked at long-term employment trends among autistic adults, and they discovered a strong link between stable employment and factors like age, overall health, and education level. So basically, younger adults with fewer health issues and more education tended to have more consistent work histories.
That makes sense, but it also kind of makes me wonder, like, if younger autistic adults are facing more challenges in finding and keeping jobs, shouldn't that be like a huge red flag?
Right.
Like, shouldn't we be focusing more research and resources on supporting them in those early years?
For sure, that's a great point. I think it highlights how even seemingly positive research findings can reveal areas where more attention and support are needed.
Right. It's not just about like, yay, good job. It's like, what else needs to be done?
Right, exactly.
So what about those other 2024 studies? Did any of them look at like the workplace itself?
Absolutely. Sam Polden's research dug into this idea of workplace disclosure. Whether or not autistic employees feel comfortable sharing their diagnosis at work.
Right, which is a huge decision.
It is, with a lot of potential consequences, both positive and negative.
Totally. I mean, like, I can only imagine how tough that decision must be. Like, on the one hand, you want to be open and authentic.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there's that fear of like, oh, am I going to be discriminated against, or will people treat me differently?
Exactly. And what their research showed was that when workplaces create genuinely inclusive environments, autistic employees are much more likely to disclose their diagnosis and, importantly, to thrive in their jobs.
So it's not just about like checking a box and being like, we're diverse. It's about creating that culture
Exactly.
where autistic employees feel safe and respected and valued.
Yes, and that was actually further emphasized in some research by Shermans and their team in the Netherlands. They actually found that while employers often express interest in hiring autistic workers, they struggle with retention.
Why is that?
So Shermans actually argues that it's often due to superficial diversity initiatives that don't actually translate into genuine appreciation for autistic contributions.
Yeah, it's like they're talking the talk, but they're not walking the walk.
Exactly. And Hoerricks suggests that this kind of performative diversity simply doesn't cut it. Like, we need deeper structural changes that actually address the root causes of inequality and exclusion.
Yeah, it's like putting a Band-Aid on a huge gaping wound.
Exactly, you nailed it.
So we've got employment stability, we've got workplace disclosure, the pitfalls of this performative diversity.
Yeah.
What other clues did these 2024 studies reveal?
So Davies and colleagues looked at the persistent issue of underemployment among autistic adults.
Okay.
And they found that many autistic adults face consistent barriers.
No.
Things like lack of tailored career support, the ongoing stigma, and insufficient accommodations.
It feels like there's this disconnect between the skills and talents that autistic individuals have and like the opportunities that are actually available to them.
Totally. And it speaks to the need for systemic change, right?
Yeah.
For policies and practices that actually level the playing field.
Totally. So did this study, did it offer any glimmers of hope? Because this is getting a little disheartening.
It did. They found that mentoring and personalized support structures can make a real difference in helping autistic adults overcome these barriers and achieve career growth.
Okay, so like targeted support,
Right.
recognizing individual needs,
Exactly.
providing the right kind of guidance can be so powerful.
It can be huge. And that's something we can all remember, right? Whether we're employers, educators, family members, we can all play a role in creating those supportive environments.
Totally. And speaking of supportive environments, Hoerricks also highlighted a study by Dennis and colleagues that explored something a little outside the box, nature-based interventions.
Interesting.
Nature-based interventions. I haven't heard that one before.
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
So think community gardening programs, outdoor work opportunities, even things like ecotherapy.
Hmm.
Now, the research was still preliminary, but they found evidence that these kinds of environments can enhance well-being and employment readiness for autistic adults.
Wow, that's so fascinating. I never would have thought of that. It makes you wonder what other creative solutions are out there.
Totally. It's an intriguing area for future research, for
Mhm.
sure, and it speaks to the importance of thinking outside those traditional boxes when it comes to supporting autistic individuals.
Absolutely. So were there any other 2024 studies that Hoerricks highlighted?
There are a couple more. One by Dashes and colleagues looked at supported employment programs in France.
Mm.
These are programs where autistic adults receive individualized job coaching and support.
That sounds promising. Did it work?
So participants in the study reported real benefits when their job coaches respected their autonomy and understood their autistic experience, but they also highlighted a recurring problem.
Well, I guess lack of funding.
Exactly, along with insufficient training for staff.
Huh.
So even when the approach is good, those systemic issues can still get in the way.
It's like a broken record player.
Totally. And it just underscores the point that Hoerricks is making throughout the whole article. You can't just tinker around the edges.
Right.
We need fundamental changes to the systems that are creating and perpetuating these inequalities.
Yeah, okay, so we talked about employment. What about housing? Did any of those 2024 studies address that?
They did a study by Nguyen and colleagues examined the factors that enable autistic adults to live independently. And one major barrier, they identified lack of suitable housing options.
Yeah, I mean, finding affordable housing is a struggle for everyone these days.
Right.
But for autistic adults, it must be even more challenging.
Absolutely. And the study actually found that most autistic adults end up living with family because finding accessible and affordable housing is so difficult.
So it's not just about physical accessibility like wheelchair ramps or wider doorways. It's about sensory accessibility,
Yeah,
affordability support systems, the whole package.
the whole thing, exactly. Nguyen's study emphasizes that while sensory-friendly design is important, it's not enough.
Right.
What autistic adults need are flexible, adaptable spaces that allow them to live autonomously while also providing opportunities for meaningful social engagement.
It's about creating environments where people can thrive on their own terms.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then finally, Hoerricks talks about this really powerful critique of group homes for autistic individuals with high support needs written by Bedard.
This sounds heavy.
It is Bedard's account describes the emotional toll on families who are forced to navigate these bureaucratic and underfunded systems just to get their loved ones basic care.
Oh.
And they call for systemic reform to support both autistic individuals and their caregivers.
It's a reminder that for some families, just finding a safe and supportive place for their loved one to live is a constant struggle.
It is.
And it
Yeah.
speaks to the need for a much more compassionate and equitable approach to disability care.
For sure. And that's a key point that Hoerricks is making, right? These aren't just abstract research findings.
Yeah.
These actually reflect the lived experiences of autistic people and their families every single day.
So we've uncovered a lot of clues here
Yeah.
with these 2024 studies. Like, what's the big picture that's starting to emerge?
So what's really striking is that each of these studies, in its own way, points to the need for systemic change.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just tweak things around the edges. We need to be thinking about housing policy, employment law, accessible healthcare, and a fundamental shift in how we understand and support autistic people.
That's a huge message. But here's where things take a turn.
Okay.
Hoerricks argues that these positive 2024 studies are actually the exception, not the rule.
Right.
When they analyzed the research that was published from January 2025 onward, they found a very stark shift in focus.
Oh.
So what did that shift look like? Give us a preview of what's to come.
In a word, medicalisation.
Ooh.
So instead of looking at the social and environmental factors that impact autistic lives, research in 2025 seems to have swung back to this very narrow medical model of autism.
Okay, so we're moving from hope and possibility to something a bit more concerning.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
All right, well, I am on the edge of my seat. We'll be right back with part 2 of our deep dive, where we'll unpack this whole shift towards medicalization and explore why it's such a cause for concern.
Welcome back. So as promised, we are diving into this whole medical model thing in autism research in 2025.
Okay, so remind me, what exactly does that mean? Like medical model? It just sounds so cold.
Yeah, it is. It basically views autism as this collection of like deficits or abnormalities that
Hmm.
need to be like treated or cured. And it focuses so much on the individual's biology and genetics, and it kind of overlooks the social and environmental factors that can really have a big impact on an autistic person's life.
So it's not asking like, how can this person be supported to thrive? It's like, how can we fix this person?
Exactly. And Hoerricks has a bunch of examples from research published in 2025 that really fit this perspective.
Okay.
Like one study by Rocha and Salguero really emphasized early diagnosis of autism.
Okay.
And they were really pushing for families to be aware of like early indicators so their kids could be diagnosed and treated like ASP.
Early intervention is always like a big topic in autism research, right?
It
Is that
is.
inherently a bad thing?
Not necessarily, but Hurricks points out some serious flaws in the study. Like the participants were mostly from clinical settings,
Okay.
which doesn't really represent like the broader autistic population.
Right.
Plus, they relied on like standardized diagnostic tools that often miss cultural and linguistic differences.
So their findings might not even be accurate or useful for a lot of people.
Exactly, and yet it's presented as like this universal truth about early diagnosis.
Interesting. So that like this emphasis on early detection, on like catching autism as early as possible,
Yeah.
it's still so dominant, even though its effectiveness is kind of debatable.
Right, and Hurrick suggests it's partly about like how research funding works. Like studies focused on early detection and medical interventions, they're more likely to get money
Uh-huh.
because they fit that autism is a problem that needs to be solved narrative.
It always comes back to money, huh?
It does, unfortunately.
It makes you wonder like who benefits the most from this kind of research. It's certainly not the autistic people themselves.
Right.
So what other examples did Hoerricks find?
There were two studies, both linked to researcher Salguero, that focused on using cannabis-based treatments like CBD specifically to manage what they called traits in autistic people.
Traits, it's so vague. What kind of traits?
Yeah. Things like hyperactivity, aggression, anxiety, sleep disturbances. Basically anything considered outside of like typical behavior.
So again, the focus is on like controlling or modifying
Yeah.
autistic people
Exactly.
instead of trying to understand and support them.
Yeah, and while the studies did show like some improvements, Horrocks points out that they were super limited, tiny sample sizes, no long-term follow-up,
Yeah.
and they didn't even try to measure how these treatments affected like quality of life.
It sounds like they were just checking boxes.
Kinda, but the research fits so neatly into the medical model,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of profit potential if CBD treatments for autism become like a widespread thing.
Okay, so we've got early diagnosis, we've got cannabis treatments.
Yeah.
This is starting to feel a little bit like our greatest hits of medicalisation.
Right.
What else is on the list?
Okay, so there's a study by Kabatash and their colleagues that got a ton of media attention.
Yeah.
They documented the use of stem cell therapy in a single autistic child and claimed significant improvements in language and motor skills.
Whoa, stem cell therapy. That's pretty intense.
It is, and Hurricks is very critical of this study. They point out it's just one case study.
Right.
So you can't generalize the results. Plus, stem cell therapy is not really accessible, especially for people who, don't have great health care.
But it makes for a catchy headline, right?
Exactly.
Stem cells cure autism.
Totally. It's like clickbait for the medical industrial complex.
It is.
And Hurricks argues that this kind of research is more about hype than helping. Like, it might grab attention, but it offers very little practical value for most autistic people.
Okay, so far we've got this focus on early detection, cannabis, stem cell therapy, all very medicalized and potentially profitable for certain industries.
Right.
Were there any studies in 2025 that actually touched on like practical stuff?
Yeah.
Like employment or housing?
A few, but they were pretty limited. Like Randall and colleagues did a study on assistive technology use among adults with disabilities,
Okay.
which included autism. And they found that while this tech is often used at home, it's rarely seen in workplaces because of like environmental and attitudinal barriers.
If the technology exists, why aren't we making it more accessible?
Right, and that's exactly what Hoerricks is asking. They argue that even the study which does touch on employment, it doesn't actually offer any concrete solutions for autistic adults who are like seeking workplace support.
So it's more about acknowledging a problem than actually trying to solve it.
Right.
Yeah,
And then there was a study by Sanders and colleagues that looked at healthcare access for adults with neurodevelopmental conditions, which included autism.
okay, so at least it's about adults,
Right.
which is more in line with what Hoerricks is talking about.
Yeah, and what they found was that the participants really wanted healthcare providers who were empathetic and knowledgeable,
Hmm.
as well as like coordinated care and accommodating environments.
So knowing what autistic patients want from their healthcare experience, that's useful, right?
It is, but again, the framing is very medicalized. It's about navigating the healthcare system, not addressing the broader social determinants of health that actually affect well-being, like having stable housing and a decent job.
So even when the research touches on relevant topics, it's still coming from this limited medical perspective.
Yeah, we're kind of going in circles.
We are.
And Hoerricks argues that the vast majority of autism research, especially stuff that gets funded and publicized, is stuck in this model of autism as a problem to be fixed, not a different way of being that deserves accommodation and support.
So what does this all mean for autistic adults?
Right.
What are the real-world consequences of this, research imbalance?
That is exactly what we will uncover in part 3.
All right, so we spent the last 2 parts talking about this kind of concerning disparity in autism research,
Right.
where on one hand, we've got some hopeful studies that actually focus on the real needs of autistic adults, but then on the other hand,
Yeah.
there's this, really dominant medical model that seems more interested in, fixing autism than actually supporting autistic people. So where do we go from here? What's the solution?
Well, Hoerricks doesn't just give us a diagnosis of the problem. They actually offer a pretty powerful vision for a way forward.
Okay.
They argue that we need a radical shift in power when it comes to autism research.
A power shift. What do you mean by that?
So they believe that autistic people need to be at the forefront of the research, not just the subjects of it. They should be the ones setting the agenda, asking the questions, and analyzing the data.
So moving away from this model where autistic people are studied by others and more towards a model where they're empowered to study themselves and their communities?
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and Hoerricks actually uses this term autistic-led research to describe this approach. And it's not just about having autistic people participate in studies that are designed by non-autistic researchers.
Right.
It's about having autistic researchers lead the way, shaping the research questions, the methodologies, the interpretations.
Who better to understand the nuances of the autistic experience than autistic people themselves?
Exactly. And Hoerricks argues that this shift to autistic-led research is essential for ensuring that the research actually benefits autistic communities.
Right.
It's about aligning those research priorities with the real needs and aspirations of autistic people.
Okay, so autistic-led research is crucial.
Oh.
What else does Hoerricks talk about?
They also emphasize the importance of what they call community-based knowledge production.
Okay.
So it's about valuing and incorporating the knowledge and experiences of autistic people and their families, even if that knowledge doesn't fit neatly into traditional academic frameworks.
So things like personal narratives, storytelling, community surveys, focus groups.
Yes, exactly.
Ways of gathering information that actually center the lived experiences of autistic people.
Yeah, and Hoerricks argues that this community-based knowledge can provide super valuable insights that traditional research often misses. It's about actually listening to those stories, those perspectives, those lived realities of autistic people.
Right.
And incorporating those insights into the research process.
It just feels like a much more holistic and respectful approach.
It is.
It's instead of viewing autistic people as data points, it's recognizing them as experts in their own lives.
Exactly. And they believe that this kind of knowledge is essential for developing truly effective supports and interventions. It's about moving away from those one-size-fits-all solutions and towards approaches that are tailored to the individual needs and strengths of autistic people.
So instead of trying to force everyone into the same mold, we're actually embracing neurodiversity in all its forms.
Right. And this leads to Hoerricks' final and maybe most challenging call to action.
Okay.
They urge us to connect the struggle for autistic liberation with broader social justice movements.
We touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think it's worth digging into a bit deeper.
Yeah.
What does that connection actually look like?
So Hoerricks argues that the challenges that are faced by autistic people, things like poverty, discrimination, lack of access to healthcare and education, they're not isolated issues.
Right.
They're actually deeply intertwined with these larger systems of oppression.
Right.
Capitalism, ableism, racism, sexism, homophobia, all those isms that create and maintain inequality in our society.
So it's about recognizing that the fight for autistic rights is part of this much bigger fight for social justice and equity for everyone.
Exactly. Hoerricks calls for solidarity and coalition building between the artistic community and other marginalized groups.
Yeah.
They believe that by working together, sharing strategies, and amplifying each other's voices, we can create a more just and equitable world for everyone.
That's such a powerful vision.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people listening are probably wondering, okay, that all sounds great, but like, what can I actually do to support this shift? Like, where do I even begin?
Right, and it can feel overwhelming to think about tackling these huge systemic issues.
It is.
And Hoerricks acknowledges that sense of overwhelm. They actually write, "This might feel overwhelming, but I am urging us to think bigger. What can WE do, even in small ways, to support this shift?"
Okay, so they're saying that even small actions can make a difference.
They can.
But what kind of small actions are we talking about?
Well, for starters, educate yourself about the issues.
Okay.
Read books and articles by autistic authors, follow autistic activists and organizations on social media, listen to podcasts that are hosted by autistic people like this one.
Oh, yeah?
The more you learn about the diversity of autistic experiences and perspectives, the better equipped you'll be to challenge those stereotypes and advocate for change.
And knowledge is power, as they say.
It is. And once you have that knowledge, don't be afraid to use it.
Yeah.
Speak up when you hear those harmful stereotypes or misinformation about autism.
Yeah?
Challenge ableist language and attitudes. Support organizations that are fighting for autistic rights and disability justice.
So it's not enough to just be aware.
No.
We need to be active allies, not just passive observers.
Exactly. And remember, change doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
It happens through countless individual acts of courage and compassion,
Yeah.
multiplied across communities and networks.
So what you're saying is that even if we feel like we're just one person, our actions can still ripple outwards and contribute to something much bigger.
That's exactly it. And Hoerricks reminds us that the fight for autistic liberation is ultimately a fight for a more humane and compassionate world for all of us. A world that values difference, embraces neurodiversity, and prioritizes the well-being of all its members.
That's a vision worth fighting for.
It is, and I think Hoerricks' work offers a really powerful roadmap for how we can begin to move towards that future together.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with?
I hope they walk away with a sense of possibility. The current state of autism research may be disheartening, but it's not the end of the story. There are people like Jaime Hoerricks who are pushing for change, who are demanding a research agenda that's truly responsive to the needs and aspirations of autistic people, and each of us can play a role in supporting that movement in however small a way to create a more just and equitable world for all.
Beautifully said. And on that note of hope and possibility, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us as we explored this complex and really important topic. Remember, change starts with awareness. And awareness can lead to action. So keep learning, keep questioning, keep challenging the status quo. Together we can build a better future for autistic people and for everyone.